Hello, everybody. This video is on chapter 22, the new era. Let me share my notes with you. And by new era, we really mean the Roaring Twenties. So let's get started on that. So you got to understand when we're talking about the Roaring Twenties, we're getting out of World War One. We're demobilizing. We're trying to come back together, especially not joining the League of Nations means we're going back into some isolation. And what you get with that is you're going to get an increase in unemployment, all right, depression, because you have all these soldiers returning from war, and there's going to be a conflict with the workers that are already here. So you're going to see a lot of minorities and women lose their jobs as the soldiers return home. And this is the time we're really talking about the Spanish flu that killed more Americans than World War One, and our response to that. And you could certainly find similarities with flu and the coronavirus as well. But as that is coming out, we also have an important time called the Red Scare, the scare of communism. See, after World War One, Russia becomes a communist country. The labor unions pretty much take over the country, and people started thinking about that coming over here. So before the war, unions had more of a positive outlook as fighting for workers, but during the Red Scare, be like, okay, are you fighting for workers? But does that mean you are into communism because they took over a country? We don't want that happening over here. So the Red Scare becomes a focal point in the early 1920s, and it also translates into immigration as well. People from Eastern Europe, from Russia, these new immigrants are targeted because maybe they're not really down with the American experiment. And so there was a lot of fear there. It was a scare. Okay, that scare led to the formation of a new division called the FBI, and also led to things like the Palmer Raid. So it was also translation World War One, where in World War One, if you spoke about the against the war, you could be arrested. In the Espionage and Sedition Act that kind of carried over into the peacetime after World War One. And if you spoke about revolutions, if you spoke about labor in a way that people thought that you were a communist, that raised suspicions as well. And then people were deported and arrested for that type of speech. One of the profile cases was the execution of Sacco and Vanzetti for a murder with very little evidence. However, they were seen as anarchists, and therefore that's really why people thought that they were killed, not for the crime that they were committed. And that was a big scandal um, in that right. In the 20s, we have three Republican presidents, okay, and they all advocated for kind of the same thing. You had um, anti-immigration laws, you had return to laissez-faire, deregulation of industries, and those were their economic policies: lower taxes, keep tariffs high, because tariffs were a part of being isolated. Okay, tariffs were taxes on imported goods. If you have too many imported goods, that means you're connected to the country that you're trading with. That means you're not really isolated. Keep tariffs high. Keep that in mind when we get into the Great Depression, um, and so on. Okay, now restrictions on immigration are going to become a big deal in the early part of 1920s, because immigration and the new immigrants in Ellis Island were, it's like such a large volume. But the Red Scare led to new immigration laws and this reduction of people allowed into the country, and nativism grew as well because of that. So you had things like Emergency Quota Act, National Origins Act, really tried to stop new immigrants from coming in. being very selective in who we let in. And then we're not part of the League of Nations in the 1920s. Now that doesn't mean that we didn't want peace, or we knew that we had to be involved in the world. So we are part of small um, peacekeeping treaties, but we're not part of the overall League of Nations, because that whole idea was, well, we were going to be tangled into foreign conflicts. One of the big parts of the international agenda in the 1920s was the Dawes Plan. This was kind of hoping to keep afloat European drama from exploding, because if you remember, after World War One, the Treaty of Versailles said Germany needed to pay reparations that they could not pay because they lost the war. So France and England, waiting for that money, scared the U.S. And in that, the U.S. lent Germany money. Germany paid their war debt and the reparations, and France and England paid the loans that they had taken from the U.S. So it was a big circle of money going around to try to keep Europe from getting, falling apart, basically. Let me continue. So more immigration measures and things like that, trying to keep peace. In 1928, Herbert Hoover is going to be elected president. His motto was rugged individualism. Laissez-faire. You're on your own. It's not the government's job. We'll give opportunities, but it's up to you to take them. That type of mentality, and we're going to keep that in mind when we go into the Greater Depression. But the economy in the 1920s really booms because you had a lot of technological advances. You had the rise of the automobile in the sense of the factory line, the assembly line. You had new inventions like the radio. You had movies becoming popular. They're not going to have any sound they're not going to have any voice, talking involved for years, but they become a main part of the American experience. Fridge, toaster, washing machine. You just have this expansion. So with cars comes roads. So that's jobs. So that's gas stations. So that's more jobs. So that's tire plant factories. That's more jobs. That's glass to make windshields. That's more jobs. Then you get the advertisement involved, because now you're on the road. Then the radio is having commercial advertisements. So there's all this booming movement of industry that's going on at the same time. Real estate, you're expanding, you're getting away from the cities because now you can drive. So those were all big deals in the roaring 20s. This decade really changes America, how it looks and how it operates. Mass production equals mass consumption. So what about when you don't have the money to buy these goods and people still want to sell them? That's when you get into credit. Credit is involved, okay? And that's installment buying. Buy now, pay later. In the real estate and in the stock market, that was a big part of it. Buy now, pay later was actually being done in the stock market. Hey, you don't have enough money to buy a stock, you could pay later. Everything is on credit. So credit becomes the name of the game in the 1920s, and you see it when there's no rules going on and people could just borrow and buy whatever they want. It becomes a big factor in the growth of America and the growth of debt, basically. But the 20s were still uneven distribution of economy. You had half Americans living at or below the poverty line. Minority groups are affected. Um, Now, another aspect of the 1920s was this traditional values versus the new world. Okay. For example, prohibition is going on in the 1920s. The 18th Amendment made alcohol illegal because traditional values thought that alcohol was a problem in society, and it led to the degradation of society, and we need to get back to our morals. So prohibition won in the 18th Amendment, but that doesn't mean that people stopped drinking. It was so hard to enforce. You had underground bars. You didn't have enough police power to fix it. So all across the country, people found a way to get around it, and it's kind of this idea that it's really hard to police morality or values and things like that. And this is where you had the increase in gang culture, because now you have to go underground to get your alcohol, and that leads to gangs and predominantly, the mafia and mob and Al Capone. This is what's going on out in cities all across the country, because people need alcohol and now they can't get it at the store, so you got to get it from somewhere. So that was a big deal. Another part of the traditional versus new age vibe was the science and teaching evolution in schools, and fighting against the theory of the biblical six-day theory of creationism. So it's creationism versus evolution. It's going to come to head in a high school in Tennessee where a science teacher teaches evolution. It's illegal there. He's going to go to trial. It becomes a national phenomenon. He loses that battle, but it becomes a trend that doesn't end, where evolution and the theory of Darwin becomes more of a more popularized, and the scientific method, and so on. So another part of the cultural battle was women, and the idea of a new age for women, flappers, these 1920s women who defied the norms, did not want to be a housewife, cut their hair, changed the way they dressed, worked, smoked cigarettes, drank, went out. That was all in respect to the World War I woman who started working in the factories. So this new age of women who got the right to vote, felt independence, was really um, pushed up against by the traditional notion of women of being proper and staying at home and taking care of the family. So that becomes a big aspect in the 1920s. Okay, and you also have the beginning of birth control in the 1920s as well. And literature, like The Great Gatsby and things like that, and again, I talk about movies, and they all become a moment in the 1920s. What about the African American experience? Thousands of African American World War I veterans that come back, they are not going to want to sit and be mistreated after feeling the victory, feeling the freedom, feeling, especially those who fought with the French, feeling the respect that they never had. So you're going to get things like the Great Migration, a push northwards to other places outside of the South. You're going to get the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance, the Jazz Age, vocalize your feelings. Langston Hughes, the great poet, you're gonna get that. That's the essence of the Harlem Renaissance, called the New Negro. So you get the ideas for Black America, Booker T. Washington versus W.E.B. Du Bois. How to do we go with Atlanta Compromise and just focus on job skills, or do we go for the arts and higher education and civil rights? Or do we do the Marcus Garvey routine, which was forget all of this. Let's go back to Africa. The Black is Beautiful movement. These are all things that are going to translate into the 1960s and forwards. This kind of question about how to achieve social success. Okay. But there was a lot of increase in the violence too, with all of this movement of African Americans, of women, of immigrants. What do you see? The racism is going to be at its all-time height. You're going to see the lynchings are going to be at their all-time height in the 1920s. The KKK is going to have millions of members in the 20s. There's going to be the Red Summer in Chicago, where riots are held as people move up there. You're gonna see Tulsa, Oklahoma, and the Black Wall Street getting burned down. You're gonna see the building of Confederate monuments to kind of rewrite history is going to be at its highest point in the 1920s. Even Rosewood in Florida, a Black community is burned down. So you have this pushback by racism. There's always going to be this tug of war as we progress, and there's going to be people against it, in all sorts of forms. Okay. And Florida is not going to be any exception. Florida is going to grow as well. You're going to have like Miami Trail getting built. Miami's airport is going to be built. A lot of people in the real estate speculation, that's also going to be a factor. So this is chapter 22. Thank you everybody for tuning in.